Well, I'm John. I'm speaking from Devon. I'm married to Jane. I have a family. I have 2 sons and 6 grandchildren. I've been involved with agriculture all my life. I was previously full-time head of agriculture at the Royal Agricultural University in Cirencester. I'm still involved there as a visiting professor and also at the University of Reading, which is where I did my own training. But I was born and brought up in Derbyshire, in rural Derbyshire. And I was, as soon as I could stand up we used to wear dungarees in those days. Anyone's old enough to remember those. They were like sort of jeans with a bib all woven into one. You could fall over in mud and, you were hermetically sealed in these things. I used to stand up in those as a toddler at the fence looking at cows. And from about the age of 4, I used to go and help feed them in quotes. And we used to, in those days, taste their food, which wouldn't have been safe in latter years. But in those days it was, because it was a mix of the original ingredients. So locust bean cake was our favorite, if anyone's old enough to remember tasting that. So that was my childhood. And I grew up working on a mixed farm in North Warwickshire, my aunt's farm. We had cattle, dairy and beef, we had pigs, we had poultry, and we had potatoes and all the cereals and short-term and long-term grass and so on. I filled in experience working with sheep later on other farms and working with sugar beet, but it was a fairly wide-ranging experience. And I wanted to leave school as soon as possible and go farming. My headmaster said that farming was a waste of time unless you went to Australia. So I concluded, although he was a nice chap, he didn't know much about farming. But my farming aunt was my ally, and my parents and she agreed that I would have an interview age 15 with Peter Buckler. Now, the connection with Peter Buckler is he was at that time the head of BOCM Silcock Animal Feeds, but he was training to take the collar for the Church of England, and he became the first chaplain to the Royal Show at Stoneleigh and to the Royal Agricultural Society of England. And he also started the Arthur Rank Centre. Lord Rank was the president of the RASC in, I think, 1970, and he knew Peter from previously working together, because he ran the British, well, he had 2/3 of the whole British film industry at the time, the Rank Foundation. And he also, in your communications area, saw the future of photocopying and started Rank Xerox. Anyway, he's going around the Royal Show, and in those days, the president comes around with his chain of office and his hands behind his back and goes around and says nice things. There was a marquee of ladies from various parishes, mothers' unions and so on, with flower festival and that sort of thing. And normally the president said, "Oh, lovely flower arrangements, good afternoon," had a cup of tea and went off. But Lord Rank said to Peter Buckler, "And what is your teaching on the Holy Spirit?" So Peter said, "Well, we would like to have the presence of the Holy Spirit here at Stoneleigh every day of the year, not just in a tent at the Royal Show, the church's tent, as it were. He's not to be confined in a tent." "Oh, and how are you going to do that?" says Lord Rank. "Well, we were hoping to start a centre." "Who's going to pay for that?" "Well, we were hoping you might. Come and see me." So Peter took a train to London. He agreed to pay for it. He said, "Yes, when do you want it?" "We want it for the Royal Show when the Queen unusually is coming to cut the ribbon." So she opened it in, I think, 1972, July the 1st, if my memory's right. Anyway, so that was the Arthur Rank Centre in place, the National Rural Chaplaincy. And that became very pivotal in all sorts of ways. And I was privileged to know not only Peter, but all the subsequent directors of the Arthur Rank Centre, and have been close friends with some of them. Anyway, that was part of our parentage as FCN. The other part was the Agricultural Christian Fellowship. And as a student, I went up to Reading. Peter Buckler said to me, "What's this I hear about you leaving school, boy? Don't." I was 15. "Go to Reading University, put it first. Goodbye, God bless you." "Yes, sir." off I went. Met my wife there, and the rest is history, and I'm still involved there as a visiting professor, as I mentioned to you at the beginning. So that was a very pivotal interview. And while I was there as a student, it struck me increasingly I wanted to apply my Christian faith to agriculture, and so I joined the Agricultural Christian Fellowship, which had been founded 10 years earlier than the Arthur Rank Centre in 1962, and I joined it in about 1966, I think. I became its secretary, and I was secretary when we had our national conference in 1974, and a bounding gentleman of tall stature with corduroy trousers came in and said, "Hello, I'm Christopher Jones. I've just come back from being a missionary in southern Nigeria. My wife and I were just about to go and be missionaries in northern Nigeria in the mid-70s, which we did. Anyway, and he said, I've just come to take over the farm that my father's handing over in Northamptonshire, and we've got lots of challenges." Anyway, I said to our then treasurer, Bob Bansback, who was the beef economist with the Meat and Livestock Commission, I said, "Bob, come on, we've got to get this fellow on the committee of the ACF, and the rest is history, because Christopher, until right now, he's just in the process of stepping down from coordinating the Agricultural Christian Fellowship." Anyway, we all got concerned about pressures in farming all over the country. And Christopher particularly studied what was going on in Europe, the farming SOS movement in Germany. And he went over and took a couple of other people, I think Vaughan Ogden and Peter Carruthers went with him in '93 to study that on the ground. Anyhow, a small steering group was founded in '93, '94, which I joined, and we eventually got launched officially really in '95, which is why we're celebrating 25 years now. And Gordon Gatwood, who was then actually an agricultural chaplain in Lincolnshire, he became the first chairman of FCN, which was then called Farm Crisis Network. Interestingly, I remember one of our meetings, I said I'd like to call it Farming Care Network, but I lost the debate, and we called it Farm Crisis Network. Actually, the word crisis became appropriate because we had in 1996, just a year after we'd started, the then Secretary of State for Health, Stephen Dorrell, stood up in the House of Commons and said, "We've got mad cow disease, BSE, bovine spongiform encephalopathy." And suddenly all exports of cattle were banned, etc., etc. It was a massive thing. And farmers who were pretty well exclusively beef farmers, say in North Devon on heavy soils and so on, they started talking about the crisis we're in. Actually, just in brackets here, the word crisis in Chinese is made up of two characters, you might know this. One is danger, and the other is opportunity, which is an interesting fact. And actually, a crisis is always an opportunity to change or to review or to reset your priorities. Anyway, farming was in trouble. Then came along the second big thing in '99, at which point Gordon had become director of the Arthur Rank Centre, Gordon Gatwood. He had, in that process, handed over to me as chairman. I was chairman of FCN for 5 years, from 1998 until 2003, during which period we got ourselves registered as a separate charity, because we've got a very distinct purpose, which is to walk with farming families in trouble of any kind, and farming families who have Christian faith or none, or other faiths. You know, we walk with whoever's in trouble, as you know, to this day. So FCN became separately officially registered both as a limited company and a registered charity in 2002. Meanwhile, in '99, going back to what was happening then, when Gordon first became the national director of the Arthur Rank Centre, there was a meeting full of invective in Bury St Edmunds in Suffolk. And the NFU were there and all the farmers who were affected by swine fever. And there was a lot of anger about how the government had handled or mishandled swine fever, how the NFU had responded and so on. And at the end of the meeting, Sally Fogden, who's still involved in East Anglia with our FCN group, quietly stood up at the back and said, I just want to tell you that there are people who care. Because what had happened at lunchtime, Canon Richard Addington, I don't know if you know this story, but he was literally on his deathbed with terminal cancer. He could hardly speak. He rang Sally up and said, these farmers are in trouble. And she said, yes, what are we going to do about it? And so she set up a bank account. By that evening meeting of that very same day, there was, I think, £1,100 or thereabouts in this bank account. And it went on from there. And the Addington Fund, actually, during the period of foot and mouth in 2001 and 2002, handed out more than £10 million worth of feed for farmers whose animals couldn't be moved, couldn't be sold, etc. And actually FCN, which is not a funding agency and still not to this day, it was able to act as a referee in deciding bona fide applications to that fund. So that kind of all came together. There are, of course, and there were, going back to the early days of FCN, other charities working. And in particular, the one that had been on the patch since 1860 was the Royal Agricultural Benevolent Institution, which some of us have supported, the RABI, and in Scotland, the RSABI. And of course, they wanted to know, who is this Johnny-come-lately organisation? What are you doing? Are you poaching on our patch? And one of my first tasks as chairman was to construct a chart, I've still got it, of the different organisations, from Rural Samaritans to the Rural Stress Information Network, to FCN, to RABI, and also, of course, in certain counties in Gloucestershire. A dear farming friend of mine had already started in 1989 Gloucestershire Farming Friends. There was a Kent Farm Helpline. So FCN from the start decided we would not compete and run groups where there was already a perfectly valid one, but we would work together. And that's what happened. I met with the then chairman of the Rural Stress Information Network. I met with the RABI, and now we work closely together. So when we go to shows here, for example, in Devon and Cornwall, we quite often share stands, or we have friendly relationships at the sharp end with those who work. And RABI also changed its approach, as you probably know, during foot and mouth, because historically it was only able to give funds for domestic bills, so that farming families in real trouble were able to pay the heating and the telephone and the water, but not to support inefficient farming or, dodgy management. Anyway, during foot and mouth, of course, it was an exceptional period. And the only thing that's near it is the sort of exceptionality we're experiencing at the moment with COVID-19. But, RABI, with our support and help and refereeing, we were able to be pointers to what one another could offer, really. Well, farming has changed in that we had, if you just look at the statistics, in the 90s, we were still in a period of exciting output from British agriculture. We were up at 3/4 self-sufficiency in homegrown produce. We're now not quite as low as we have been, but on last year's figures, we're at 64%, according to NFU data, DEFRA data. And so, the pressures on farming have been considerable during the period of 25 years that FCN has existed. And especially the highest cost factor in British agriculture is labour. And so we've got fewer staff, we've got increasing dependence, particularly in the fruit and horticulture sectors, on having a sensible seasonal agricultural workers scheme, because 90% of fruit and veg are picked by non-Brits. One of the good things about COVID has been people who have not previously volunteered to help harvest are doing so, but that's costing British farmers a bit more because they do it more slowly than, you know, regular seasoned pickers, obviously, and they have to be trained. So those kind of pressures have come on. I think also what the late Lord Barber of the Countryside Commission once said, farming is a goldfish bowl into which increasing numbers of the public wish to peer with interest, and sometimes, of course, with criticism. So farmers have felt undervalued, I think. I think we were very touched when I was chairman during Foot and Mouth, because I was contacted by someone in London who said, look, we've hired the Albert Hall. We've put together various people to put on an evening, all in aid of the farm aid charities. Will you come? And the place was packed. That was actually where the Prince of Wales and his friend, the late Duke of Westminster, also attended. And it was very moving because it started off with a farmer friend of mine, actually, who'd been culled in a contiguous cull with his pigs, with an Anglepoise lamp and a glass of water in the middle of the Albert Hall. And it finished with a vet at the same Anglepoise lamp and glass of water, who spoke very movingly about the fact that he'd come into veterinary science to save animals' lives, and now he was being required to condemn them, basically. And how and we had a lot of vets who came to us during that time, and still do from time to time. The other thing I was going to say about urban care, every farmer in Gloucestershire, for instance, got a card from the Church of England schools in that county, coloured in by the children, of animals, farm animals, and it just said, God cares, we care. We're thinking of you and praying for you during Foot and Mouth, which was very touching and, you know, made farmers feel suddenly, well, perhaps the public do respect us and care more about us than we thought. And I mean, we've got to go on building that, obviously. I mean, consumers are our best hope if we look about going forward in agriculture. And it's interesting, a recent survey of the Farming and Food Commission a couple of weeks ago, where they asked 380 people who are, you know, involved in moving and shaking agriculture, what they hoped might come out of COVID. One of the answers said, 93% of the respondents said we want more investment in local food chains. Hooray, you know, because that is our best hope. And it's critical in so many areas and different sectors. It's not the place to go into all the possibilities, but we live in times of opportunity as well as danger. But I think, how is FCN perceived? Really, in the early days, we were very concerned not to be perceived only as approachable if you are in a really serious crisis, i.e., you know, if someone was seen speaking to an FCN member at an agricultural show or a cattle market, oh, I saw Charlie Jones talking, you know, he must be thinking of committing suicide, or he must be about to go bankrupt. So we wanted to, A, prevent farmers getting into that stage anyway, as far as we could. And one of the things that I've done a lot of my work on over the years in this country and abroad is farmer groups, farmer study groups. The one we'd started on the Cotswolds with cereals is still going 43 years on. And out of it came the Arable Group, which is the major trialling organisation near market. It's now merged with the National Institute of Agricultural Botany. And we celebrated, 40 years of that aspect of the work last November, when we could still meet together. And it was the 100 years of the NIAB in Cambridge. Anyway, so I'm a great believer in farmers groups. And I said to Christopher Jones one day, we ought to start some farms groups with FCN, which will be the sort of the prophylactic treatment. Yes, we're there when someone's about to drive off a cliff or near the edge, but let's try and create circumstances amongst farmers where they're less likely to do that. And the best hope is meeting with other farmers and sharing, you know. So I was convinced. I mean, I remember, just as an aside, in our cereal group during the very halcyon days, as we now look back, in the early 1980s, at one of our meetings when we'd been going for 5 years, one of the farmers said to me over the pub lunch we were having, you know, I don't know where I'd be without this group. I said, what do you mean? He said, I don't know how I'd survive without this group. He said, because I lunge from one meeting to the next month. I know I'm going to meet people who are in the same shoes as me, who grapple with the same issues and who understand where I am. And so we did that. And in Devon at one time, we had 18 of these groups going. But the problem for farmers in attending meetings of any kind, those or any other, is that there are fewer to carry the load. I mean, the massive reduction in the farm labour force during the 50 years that I've been involved with agriculture is huge. So estates that would have employed 30 now do it all with 2. You know, we're not talking about marginal adjustments to the labour force. So if you're the gopher on everything and the manager of an ever expanding acreage, you've got to think more than twice before you take a meeting out. But with those study groups, we always said, look, you've got to have a meal at some time of the day. So let's agree to have a pub lunch together, or just, you know, have a simple bun and a cup of tea in the farm kitchen before we go around each other's farms on a monthly basis. Anyway, so FCN has changed. I think it was good and significant that the board decided in 2013 to change the name, but keep the acronym, quite rightly, to Farming Community Network, to signal really to people out there that we're there for longer term issues, not just for an immediate crisis. And in particular, of course, farm succession, which still is very badly planned for. I mean, maybe during this COVID crisis, farm families have had time to reflect, although for the most part, they've had to keep going and sometimes do extra work to, you know, dispense their produce or to set up a farm shop where they didn't have one before. The other whole segment which has risen in profile with government is mental health. And when I was chairman of FCN, I used to say, well, you know, I really think we ought to interact with the Department of Health at far more levels than just mental health, important though that is. Because, you know, the therapeutic value and the therapeutic legitimate income streams that farmers can earn from people coming onto their farms as visitors, for farm-based activities and so forth, that is huge. And that's a whole area that we need to explore. So that's kind of where I see FCN having a role at this big time of change. And it is a big time of change. I mean, we've been running basically on the 1947 Agriculture Act, which was immediate post-Second World War. We've got this major bill going through Parliament, and we do need to influence it and some of us are trying to do that, so that it's really in the national interest and in the interest of sustainability of farming, really. FCN is a confidential, farmer-friendly service which is offering to walk with you and to listen. Very, very importantly, we're not an advisory service, we're not a counselling service, we're not a funding agency, but we are farming people who understand farming and who try to put you in touch with appropriate sources of help and point you to where you can take forward the particular issue that you have kindly shared with us in confidence. And we're there to help whosoever. I mean, it's interesting, if you talk about the basis of FCN, I mean, here in Devon, we still have, I'm still chairman here in Devon of FCN for the last 6 years, and we still have more than 100 new cases each year, plus ongoing cases in the county of Devon. this is not, it's not an issue that is going away. And I think during the coronavirus lockdown, a lot of things have been on hold because farmers have had to just get on with it. There have been a few in real crisis if their major outlets of their produce were suddenly not wanting them, if they're major catering outlets and so forth. But for most farmers, we are in a period of slightly improving compared with a few months ago. But going back to the original basis for me, it's interesting. When I was born, my mother had a friend, not my farming aunt, another friend who I called Auntie Dora. And Auntie Dora bought me a picture, and it was painted by a lady who did a lot of Sunday school illustrations, Margaret Barber, I think she was called, or Margaret. Anyway, I forget her surname for the minute. She painted a picture of Jesus in a manger surrounded by farm animals and various wild animals. And it just quoted the text, which is the last verse of the Psalms, Psalm 150, verse 6, which says, "Let everything that has breath praise the Lord." And then the verse goes on to say, "Now you praise the Lord." In other words, first, do your best to provide the conditions for your crops and your animals to thrive. And that would also include the people who are involved in caring. So another thing my farming aunt used to say to me is, if you can't get the people right, forget it. There's plenty of people falling over themselves to give you technical advice about your crops, your machinery, your animals. But if you can't get the staff team right, if you can't get the morale right, forget it. It's absolutely at the heart of farming. So FCN is at that juncture, really, trying to help people to resolve issues that are getting them down, but also trying to help them positively to move forward. For our volunteers, we need to be assured that our services are needed. We need to be sensitive, pastorally sensitive to people. We need to be agriculturally aware as ever. We need to step down if we're in a crisis ourselves. The danger is if when someone's in their own crisis, they rush around to find someone in a worse crisis. And actually, you need to sit down and resolve your own. So that's very important. And as volunteers, we do need to have our own support networks. And the ultimate support, of course, is God himself, to turn to him and trust in him. When my wife and I married nearly 51 years ago now, the text at our wedding was from Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. And that applies to anything in life, really. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Don't lean on your own understanding. In all your ways, acknowledge him, and he shall direct your paths.